At the end of World War II, the Red Army launched one of the most unforgiving operations of the post-war era, the mass seizure of German soldiers. Many members of the SS died in the final months of the war, and countless others were taken by the Allies. Fully aware of what SS troops had done to Soviet civilians during the occupation, many frantically tried to reach the Americans or the British. Some managed to escape, but most ended up in Soviet custody. For years they had been taught that communists were monstrous enemies who would destroy them. Now they would witness Soviet hospitality firsthand. The goal was not only to detain them but also to use them as a labor force for rebuilding the ruined Soviet Union. Survival in these camps depended more on luck and physical toughness than on any form of humanitarian concern. Through blood and snow, the Soviet fury erupted. After the Battle of Kursk ended in disaster for the Wehrmacht, the Germans began withdrawing. From that moment onward, the Eastern Front became a nightmare for the Nazis, driven by terrifying beliefs about what the Soviets would do if they were captured. And whenever Soviet forces had the chance to seize German soldiers, they were often ruthless. However, many troops and even some Waffen-SS units still surrendered, though the Soviets were almost never merciful to anyone wearing the black uniform. When they saw my uniform, they dragged me out of the line of prisoners, one survivor recalled. They stripped me and beat me with rifle butts, shouting Babi Yar and Smolensk. I understood immediately. They were taken to a camp, but for SS men, there was no trial, only death. Everyday names were called, and those men never returned. This one man was lucky to live, because most captured SS members were executed immediately. Those spared were often held for trials or sent straight to Soviet labor camps without any hearing at all. Only a small number ever made it back. Even during the war, Stalin had ordered that these prisoners of war be shipped to camps. There was a huge difference in how the Soviets treated regular Wehrmacht soldiers compared to SS personnel. The former were viewed as ordinary prisoners of war, while the latter were labeled war criminals, especially the Einsatzgruppen and SS officers. In January 1945, the Ninth Army of the Wehrmacht was trapped near Warsaw. Lieutenant Guard Keller still remembers the chaos. We were outgunned, outnumbered, and frozen to the bone. Every day more of my men were killed or vanished into the snow, taken by the Russians. Surrender was the only choice if you didn't want to die. Treatment of those who gave up varied depending on the captors, the situation, and the mood of the moment. Private Hans Mayeller described his first encounter with Soviet troops. They stripped us of everything, watches, boots, anything valuable. One of our soldiers resisted and was shot instantly. There was no room for mercy. Soviet compassion toward Germans had disappeared long before, after witnessing the atrocities committed on their people. Brutality toward the Waffen-SS was almost expected. Their uniforms and tattoos marked them as ideological fighters, and Soviet troops knew exactly how they themselves would have been treated if the situation were reversed. Many had seen the devastation left behind wherever the SS had passed. There was no mercy. Major Friedrich Lutz of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf was captured near Budapest. He survived. We knew what they thought of us. Some men tried to tear off their uniforms, but it was useless. The tattoos gave us away. Lutz was beaten savagely before being forced to march barefoot through the snow to a prisoner assembly point. At least he lived to recount the story. Many in Hungary were not so fortunate. Near Debrecen, about 200 kilometers east of Budapest, soldiers of the Wehrmacht's 24th Panzer Division witnessed mass executions of their officers. Radio operator Wilhelm Hauer survived only by luck and quick thinking. He pretended to be dead among the bodies. He remembered how the Soviets justified their actions as cleansing, since every officer who had commanded in Nazi Germany was considered part of the collective guilt for war crimes. Even high-ranking officers were not spared the humiliation of capture. General Maximilian von Wakes, commander of Army Group F, surrendered to the Red Army in early 1945 after being overwhelmed in Yugoslavia. Although he was not executed immediately due to his rank and the Soviets' desire to interrogate him, he still had to endure months of harsh treatment before being handed over. Western authorities, but for the others who weren't protected by the high rank. This capture was just the beginning. They had to march for tens of miles towards the nearest railway stations to be transported to the camp's food and water. Rations were minimal, still better than What they gave before the situation turned around those who fell behind or collapsed were shot on sight, and among them was a medic. Carl share his journal today reflects these horrifying moments. For these soldiers the march was like a death's parade. Men fell by the dozens, their bodies left behind as markers of our passage. A Soviet officer who followed one of the marches commented coldly, "The dead are easier to count once." Again the tables had turned, and the ones who survived the march awaited transportation in overcrowded cattle cars. They could barely sit, and the stench was almost unbearable. Those who barely made it through the march couldn't survive this and died due to starvation, disease, or exposure, missing the sight of gulags, their final dreadful destination. The stench was unbearable. Urine, sweat, and death all mingled. We tried to keep each other alive, sharing scraps of bread and snow, but it wasn't enough. Remember Franz Keller, a Wehrmacht soldier who was on a train to Perm. For these men the war was over and the next chapter of their lives began, but in reality the war still very much raged. And the final battle for Berlin started. And in the capital city the remaining soldiers had nowhere to hide. The fall of final battle for Berlin. The Black Sun, Berlin's last captives. When the battle for Berlin started, it was basically all over, and only delusional Nazis still believed in any chance for victory. Even Heinrich Himmler himself attempted to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies behind Hitler's back. Soon the news leaked, and Himmler was declared a traitor. Like Himmler in custody, suicides became common among SS officers. They knew what awaited them if captured in a building near the Reich Chancellor. SS General Wilhelm Moner gathered his men for last stand in as the Soviets overwhelmed their position. Some of them decided to perform collective suicide. They sat in a circle, their faces pale but resolved. Some whispered prayers, others just stared at the ground. When the order came, they swallowed the capsules in silence. I couldn't do it, the Soviets caught me. Hours later Wilhelm Moe didn't do that. He tried to flee, however, as Soviet engineers began flooding the tunnels with gasoline and setting them on fire. Mona and his remaining men had to appear and surrender. As a high-ranking SS officer, Mona had to endure brutal interrogation. Survivors claimed to have heard his screams. He was eventually sent to the Soviet Union, where he spent 6 years in solitary awaiting trial and was eventually released due to lack of evidence. Still the question mark over his alleged torture still remains, because the Soviet claims it didn't happen and he didn't talk about it. Some other SS officers tried to blend in and erase their past. They often blended into the streams of refugees trying to escape. Others were less fortunate. Soviet soldiers eager for retribution organized brutal searches for SS members, and the ones who were found suffered a lot. We found them hiding in the basement, huddled together like rats. They had burned their papers and changed into civilian clothes, but we knew who they were. We dragged them into the street, and the people screamed for justice. Some were shot on the spot, others were taken away. None of them would live long. The fear and paranoia entered the SS ranks faster than the Soviets, and the words of their brutality preceded them. Major Dietrich Ziegler of the Rathvan SS led a group of young soldiers when he was captured as Soviet T-34 tanks emerged on the streets. He issued desperate orders to hold the line, fight to the last man. Soon their position was overrun and their situation was lost at that moment. Ziegler, overwhelmed by fear, ditched his uniform in an attempt to blend in with Wehrmacht regulars. His last attempt was futile because the Soviet troops recognized him, he was maybe snitched by some of his subordinates, but the more likely reason was his SS-issued pistol. They knew Ziegler later wrote in a smuggled note from captivity they always knew for the Soviets there was no difference between men and women when it comes to war criminals, and although they weren't typical members of the many women were known for their sadism. During the war, especially female guards of the concentration camps, a Soviet journalist who followed the Red Army clearly remembered how they dragged one woman from the ruins of a building she was accused of having been a guard at Ravensbrück, although her identity wasn't confirmed. The woman, a civilian, was forced to strip in the street to reveal SS tattoos on her body. From that moment, she was a civilian, no more Soviet. Soldiers tied her to a lamppost, leaving her to the vengeful crowd. She was beaten till she fell unconscious, and one Soviet soldier eventually put an end to her misery with a gunshot. On the other hand, Wehrmacht soldiers who surrendered didn't face the same justice as the SS. The soldiers who were ranked lower were often just disarmed and sent to the camps for the prisoners of war. There their chances were much higher than the Soviets had in German camps. The ones who were high-ranked were always interrogated but mostly treated better. At first, later most of them ended up being trialed for war crimes by early May. Berlin was reduced to ruins. Hitler was dead, and the SS, once the elite force, effectively ceased to exist with its members arrested, hunted, or dead. The Wehr had capitulated, but this wasn't the end for the people who were involved in these two organizations, especially for the ones captured by the Soviets. One Soviet soldier describing the fall of Berlin wrote in his journal, "We fought for every street, every building, and when it was over there was no joy, only silence. The city was a graveyard, and the people we found there looked like ghosts. They asked us for mercy, but we had seen too much and lost too much. There was no mercy left to give. Finally the war was over, and the Allies faced a dilemma: what to do with these war criminals, and what to do about the organizations consisting of hundreds of thousands of people. The crimes were too severe to be left unpunished. Also, should the whole country be put on trial? Who should be sentenced? And how? Here the Allies had different opinions, but the Soviets were the most harsh justice and read the Soviet pursuit. The Soviet pursuit of Nazi war criminals. Of Nazi war criminals, the most well-known trials for the war criminals and the ones in charge of the Nazi war machinery were the Nuremberg trials, held between November 1945 and October 1946. These trials were held by all the Allied powers together, signaling the beginning of prosecutions for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The Soviet Union was the nation that mostly insisted on the trial, and the lawyer Aaron Trenin first formulated and used the idea of a crime against peace, although the spotlight was on the most important Nazi leaders like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, or Wilhelm Kittel. The number of convicted reached 161 from 199 defendants. Among them 37 were sentenced to death by hanging, not by firing squad. That way the Allies wanted to show that these people weren't soldiers and officers anymore, they were war criminals. Also, the SS was proclaimed a criminal organization, but the Nuremberg trials were far from being the only one conducted on the Nazis after the war. Although the Soviet Union participated in the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the Soviets felt that they needed to do more as the ones whose people suffered the most under the Germans. So they conducted their own series of Trials against members of the SS and the Wehrmacht. The collaborators also faced consequences. These trials were all similar, swift and unforgiving, showing anger and desire for revenge. The Soviet trials began almost immediately after the war ended, some even during the liberation of the country. The press followed closely these trials and used similar names as the prosecution in the courtroom to refer to the defendants, terms such as thugs, bandits, degenerates, and perverts. One of these trials took place in Kiev, especially for the members of the SS-Einheit group, and survivors and witnesses spoke about the unsettling scenes, like the one where the children were forced to dig their graves before being executed. Interestingly enough, the accused SS officers mostly showed no remorse during the trial. They almost always said that they had orders that needed to be carried away. Their indoctrination was completed years ago. One of the rare ones who accepted his guilt was Frederick Yekin during the RIA trials in 1946. He was the SS general who implemented the gene system for faster mass murder, having around 100,000 souls on his conscience. He showed some remorse. "I have to take full responsibility for what happened in the borders of Ostland, and this greatly increases my guilt. I will accept a sentence in full, either true or a lie." This confession didn't save him, and John was hanged in January 1946. Most of the convicted were hanged publicly, with the local population present enjoying the gruesome end of their former oppressors, often responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. There was no mercy, and as one of the Jewish survivors of the Babier massacre said to one of the SS Einheits Grin accused during a trial in 1946, "You looked at us like animals, less than human. I watched you shoot my wife and son. You laughed. Now you stand here in front of me and you ask for mercy. Did you show mercy to the Soviet Gulag family? Cold justice." German lives in the gags of the Soviet Union. The Germans who ended up in Soviet gulags after the war were a mix of Wehrmacht soldiers, SS officers, and civilian collaborators. They had different stories before the end of the war, but here they were all the same. First, they needed to survive the journey to cold Eastern R. Desperate and afraid after the capture and trials, not like what they did to the Jews, but this time they had to endure overcrowded and unheated trains and were forced to march for weeks without any compassion. They were fed irregularly, mostly some scraps. Many were ill from dentry or typhus. The ones who were already weak didn't survive the long route to the camp, and they didn't get the funeral. Their bodies were thrown from the train. Arrival at the Gulag offered no relief. It was a new world for them, scary, unimaginable, unpredictable, and inevitable. The camps contained only bare wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire. The guards hated the prisoners with burning passion, since many of them lost family members and comrades during the invasion. These guards often unleashed their anger on prisoners with beatings and kicking. The barracks inside resembled those where the Germans were once guards, and the Soviets let the natural conditions create the atmosphere. Inside it was cold, overcrowded, with no heat and real shelter, and it was filthy. But these prisoners weren't there just to be removed from the civilization. They were there to work. The day started a little before dawn with a rude awakening, and the first thing to do was work, no matter what the weather was like, and the work was very demanding and physical. Germans had to cut trees and mine with primitive tools, as well as construct buildings, railroads, and other infrastructure. It was slave labor. They had quotas that needed to be fulfilled. And these were unrealistically high. Failure to succeed meant less food. Many couldn't withstand it and perished in the camps. One of the most well-known prisoners in the Soviet prisons was Friedrich Paulus, the former field marshal, who had commanded the German Sixth Army and surrendered at Stalingrad in 1943. He was the only German field marshal ever who surrendered and was treated as a traitor because of that. Maybe that was the reason Paulus lived in better conditions than most other Germans. Also, he was used for Soviet propaganda purposes. Although isolated, he never experienced the horrors of the gulags, and after 10 years of imprisonment, Paulus was released. He lived in communist East Germany, where he lived the remaining 4 years of his life. Unlike Paulus, ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers like Heinz Gla, a 21-year-old, were not spared. Gla was imprisoned in a camp in KMA, infamous for its brutal conditions. In smuggled letters, Gla described the conditions he was living in, working in. He was freezing and he was hungry still. He survived a decade there before he was released, but the consequences took a toll on his health, and Gla didn't live long enough to celebrate his 40th birthday. The fates of many of these inmates depended on pure luck or the fact who was their guard at the time. Some guards were excessively cruel, beating prisoners on a daily basis, while others considered this as just a regular job and didn't participate in the beatings. Falling ill also could mean a death sentence, since medical care didn't exist in these camps. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and scurvy were regular among the inmates. Around 350,000 German prisoners didn't survive until the end of their sentence. One survivor remembered how he and a group of prisoners had to dig trenches in the permafrost for 12 hours a day. The soil was freezing and hard, and the cold was so intense that men would lose fingers and toes due to weather conditions. Even the food was a part of mistreatment. Prisoners mostly ate watery soup, cold water soup, and just a few small pieces of bread each day. There was no meat and not nearly enough nutrients to endure hard work. Many turned to stealing food, risking severe punishments like beating to death. Many prisoners lost their minds due to hunger, and there were accounts of grass eating and even cannibalism, also punishable by death. Franz Bago, one of those who survived, described how desperate they were in hunger. We would scrape the frost from the walls of their barracks to quench their thirst. We ate anything we could find: potato peels, bits of grass. Hunger was the only thing permanent in the Soviet system. There were no names like the Nazis earlier did. To them, the Soviets now forbade any human individuality from these prisoners. Instead of names, they were numbers. To increase dehumanization, there was no communication with the outside world. Families of those who were sentenced in the Soviet Union often had no idea what happened to their loved ones, yet many survived, and after Stalin's death, life they became a little easier. Releases became more common when the Khrushchev era began in the Soviet Union, but many weren't that lucky. Even today, there are many bones in the cold Russian soil, covered by unmarked graves, shadows of captivity, the forgotten struggle of Germany's lost soldiers. Those who survived had problems fitting into the New World, still considered as Nazis. Also, the trauma of the gulags never left them. But there was no sympathy for the Nazi German soldiers, since both post-war German countries wanted to erase and forget that part of their history. Most of these prisoners of war served some 8 to 10 years in the labor camps and were freed somewhere around 1953. The war had been over for years, but they were fighting on the front inside to find a place in the New World. When Heinrich Schreiber in the ancient days of war Wehrmacht sergeant arrived in Munich in 1955, the city was both familiar and different. He had nothing but a small bundle of belongings wrapped in a faded blanket. He changed. I was not the man who left, and Munich was not the city I remembered. The division between East and West had solidified, and there was a shadow over former SS members. Many of them had false hopes of job security as soldiers, but they were considered ashamed of the P, and the military wasn't highly regarded in Germany anymore. They had no clothes, no property, no job, and no work skills. The German authorities didn't support their citizens and behaved badly to those who returned from captivity, stating that they deserved their fate as war criminals. Hermann Bauer, a former SS officer, firsthand felt that new reception. His wife had remarried because of no news from him. She thought Bauer died. I was a stranger in my own home. Finding a job was an impossible task, and he was constantly watched by the police. Even the others who returned from the gulags looked down on the SS veterans. They treated us like lepers, not soldiers, but war criminals, no matter if we did anything or not. Those who managed to find jobs often worked as physical laborers and only low-paid jobs. Schreiber became a janitor at a local school. Since his school days were cut short because of drafting, he wanted to be an engineer. The students would whisper about me. He said to them I was just another old soldier who had lost everything, and he was one of the lucky ones. Still, some managed better, especially their younger Wehrmacht veterans who took advantage of post-war reconstruction efforts in West Germany. In that reconstruction, they built new lives. Jobs in factories were desirable and better paid, so they built or rebuilt homes. This also influenced positively on their view of themselves. Since they were no longer destroying, they were building something new. Yet for every uplifting story, there were many more grim ones. Most of the men from these darker tales had one thing in common: they simply couldn't adjust. Although it was never deeply researched, the impact on their mental health was immense. There were no evaluations or medical checks, but it was obvious they were suffering from PTSD. Nightmares of the camps were frequent, along with memories of those who never returned. I could hear their voices. They would call out to me in the darkness, "Don't leave us behind," said Riga, one of the survivors. Many still carried the guilt of having been part of a war machine, having witnessed or taken part in atrocities and horrors. Suicide rates among them were high, and many turned to alcohol in an attempt to forget. As mentioned earlier, Bauer eventually fled to a small village to escape everything. "I became a shadow," he said in one of his last interviews. "No one wanted to know me, and I didn't want to know anyone." In time, Germany moved forward, but they did not. "We were soldiers, captives, survivors," Schreiber wrote to a friend, "but we were also forgotten. They were viewed with disgust, as if they were some kind of stain that needed to be scrubbed away," wrote Gal Biederman in his memoirs. Although their treatment was harsh, other factors weighed on them as well. Many couldn't believe that some high-ranking Nazi officials, who had slipped away from punishment, soon returned to important positions in industry. Conclusion. After the war, SS and Wehrmacht prisoners of war experienced the harshest conditions in the Soviet Union. Unlike in the West, here there was a strong desire for revenge and justice. Different fates met different individuals. Just as there were war criminals who escaped judgment, there were also ordinary soldiers, men who hadn't committed any atrocities, who faced severe punishment. It was the end of the war, and the victors decided what justice was. Many argue that the punishment matched the crime, and this remains a broadly accepted belief in Russia. And when they returned home, even though they were free from their Soviet captors and had survived their imprisonment, that captivity continued to live inside them.